In the storied history of the NFL, there are only 4 quarterbacks to start a Super Bowl for multiple teams. If you ask the average fan to name the 4, odds are they'll get 3 right off the bat, getting the 2 men in the Hall of Fame and the man who will be a first ballot Hall of Famer and is widely regarded as the greatest to ever play the sport. You have Tom Brady, who did it with the Patriots and the Buccaneers. You have Peyton Manning, who did it with the Colts and the Broncos, and in Manning's case, started multiple Super Bowls with each of those teams. You have Kurt Warner, who did it with the Rams and the Cardinals. And then you have the 4th one, which is this man right here, Craig Morton. Morton's a weird one, because many people associate him with being a symbol of failure. He didn't look good for the Cowboys at Super Bowl V, and with the Broncos at Super Bowl XII, he had the worst game by any quarterback in a Super Bowl, going 4 for 15 while throwing no touchdowns and 4 interceptions, and posting a passer rating of 0.0. He was also traded to the New York Giants in the middle of the 1974 season for a first-round pick, in one of the most disastrous trades in NFL history, seeing as Morton did next to nothing for the Giants, who were a mess of a franchise, and the Cowboys got the number 2 pick in the draft as a result of it, which they used to draft Randy White, a defensive lineman who made it to the Hall of Fame. For most people, when they think of Craig Morton, the first association in their mind is a bad one. However, this undermines just how good of a player he was. Because here's the thing about Craig Morton. He was a darn good quarterback, and might be the greatest quarterback in NFL history to never make a Pro Bowl. The man was a tough son of a gun. He came off the bench in a game against the Seattle Seahawks in 1979 and single-handedly led a 24-point comeback in the second half, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. There are numerous stories of Morton being in the hospital, only to then be playing 24 hours later and leading his team to a positive result, including a game on Thanksgiving in 1969 against the 49ers, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. He finished 4th in the MVP voting in 1981, when at the age of 38, he threw for 3,200 yards and 21 touchdowns, making him the only quarterback in NFL history at the time to be at least 38 years old, throw more touchdowns than interceptions, and throw for at least 2,000 yards. And in the year that he guided the Broncos to their first Super Bowl appearance in franchise history, which was also their first playoff appearance ever, he finished 2nd in the MVP voting. And by the time the man retired after the 1982 season, he was inside the top 15 all-time in passing yards and in passing touchdowns. In fact, by the time he retired, if you took a list of every quarterback to have at least 180 passing touchdowns and 27,000 career passing yards and start in at least 2 NFL title games, whether it be the NFL Championship or the Super Bowl, the list would consist of just 6 names: Fran Tarkenton, Len Dawson, Johnny Unitas, Y.A. Tittle, Terry Bradshaw, and Craig Morton. The other 5 guys are Hall of Famers. That is elite company to be in. To say that Craig Morton was underrated would be putting it lightly, especially considering how he is remembered today in NFL history, as there's a reason why he played 18 years in the NFL and started multiple Super Bowls. But what's crazy about all of this, for the man you've been watching this entire time, is that we were this close to none of it happening. In fact, you could maybe argue that none of this should have ever happened in the first place. Craig Morton passed away at the age of 83, but he almost passed away nearly 6 decades before that in 1969. It's a story that's been largely forgotten about through NFL history, but it's a story that deserves a deep dive today in light of Morton's passing, because we truly were one split second away from an absolute tragedy one of the biggest what-if moments in NFL history, and a life that was taken far too soon. Here's how it went down. The year is 1969, and we've got a big wedding on our hands in New York City with Joey Heatherton, one of the biggest actresses in the country, and Lance Rensel, the star wide receiver on the Cowboys, who had over 1,000 yards receiving in 1968 and finished 4th in the NFL in that department. If you're wondering what the Travis Kelce Taylor Swift equivalent would be for the 1960s when it comes to NFL relationships, this was probably the closest. Now, this relationship didn't last, as the two divorced shortly after the wedding, after Rensel was caught exposing himself to minors. But that's not the point of this video. The point is that Rensel and Heatherton were about to get married, and Morton, being friends with Rensel, seeing as the two were teammates and were both the same age, was invited to the wedding in New York City, where Heatherton lived and worked extensively on television and in movies. Now, of course, Morton had been to New York before, anytime the Cowboys traveled to New York to take on the Giants. However, he never really had a chance to sightsee. This was the off-season, and Morton was coming up for the wedding, alongside some other Cowboy teammates. So he figured that before the wedding, he'd spend some time in New York with them, do all the tourist things, and celebrate. And one of the places that Morton went to the night before the rehearsal dinner, alongside some of his friends, was an establishment called Gillies. Gillies was a nightclub in the middle of Manhattan, where the members of the Rat Pack, like Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, would hang out. It makes sense as to why Morton would be at Gillies, seeing as Joey Heatherton knew Dean Martin. So all of the Cowboys who came up to New York for Rensel's wedding, including guys like Ralph Neely and Don Meredith, were invited to the club. Morton thought he was going to enjoy the night out with his teammates before the rehearsal dinner the next day, and that would be one of the highlights of his trip to New York. Oddly enough, before I go any further, this isn't the only weird story involving Craig Morton and a wedding, as if you want to learn more about a wedding he partook in a decade later, where he rushed out of the stadium in the middle of a game to make it in time, click the card in the upper right corner. But back to this story. Morton remembered at some point during the night that he had to make a phone call. Remember that this was 1969. There were no cell phones. If something like this took place today, this would be a complete non-story. Morton would just pull out his phone and maybe go someplace quiet so he could hear the other end of the line. And that'd be that. In 1969, however, you had to use the publicly available payphones. And when Morton went to the payphone at Gillies, it was occupied by someone. I'm not sure what call Morton needed to make, but it seemed pretty necessary from everything that I could find. Morton asked the guy who was currently using the payphone how long the call was going to be, to which the guy replied, "Get lost." Now at this point, Morton could have walked away and just chalked it up to someone being a New York jerk. That might have been the smart thing to do. Morton, however, decided not to do that because he really needed to make this call. He was also a little bit intoxicated by this point, and by a little bit, I mean a lot, as reports indicated that he was on his 10th or 12th beer of the night. So Morton, maybe not in the right mindset, clapped back at the man and asked, "What kind of way is that to act, you creep?" The two exchanged some not-so-family-friendly words, and eventually, Morton realized that this arguing was getting him nowhere, and he was just going to let the man at the payphone do what he needed to do. The man at the payphone wasn't budging, and it just wasn't worth it. With that, Morton went back to his table with his Cowboy teammates and decided to call it a night. He was going to go back to the hotel room by himself, where he'd make the call there and get some sleep before the rehearsal dinner for Rensel's wedding. And in a normal world, that's where the story ends. In a normal world, Morton walks back to his hotel, makes whatever phone call he needs to make, and goes to sleep like nothing happened, with the worst thing of the night being Morton waking up the next day with a mild hangover. However, while Morton was walking back, there were 4 guys waiting for him on the not very well lit street. One of the guys happened to be, you guessed it, the man who was on the phone who Morton told off. The other 3 guys happened to be his cronies. At this point, Morton's life was on the line. It was 4-on-1, with the one being intoxicated. The 4 men collapsed in on Morton and started beating the ever-loving crap out of him. It truly felt at this moment like Morton was about to die, or at the very least, sustain a huge beating. The odds were not in his favor whatsoever. Even if he didn't die during this, he was going to get beat into a pulp so badly that he wouldn't be able to play, or attend the wedding, or move around at all. He needed an absolute miracle to get out of this pickle. And somehow, by the grace of God, he got one. By some weird and wacky coincidence, a random man was watching this all unfold and decided to do something about it and started beating up the 4 guys. Morton had just been jumped and gang slugged, and for some reason, a person who happened to watch it decided to enter the fight and protect Morton. Morton never knew the man's name who made the attackers flee and took them on, as before Morton could thank the man, he fled the scene. But just like that, thanks to one courageous bystander who happened to be in the right place at the right time and decided to take on a random group of attackers 4-on-1, even though he had no obligation to do so and was putting his life and health on the line, Craig Morton was saved. Morton sustained a pretty bad injury in the attack, as he suffered a broken thumb. But obviously, this could have been a lot worse. Considering the alternative in a 4v1 when you're intoxicated and outnumbered, and it's the middle of the night on the streets of New York, with the alternative being a coma or death, a broken thumb isn't too bad in the grand scheme of things, especially in the off-season when you've got plenty of time to recover from that, which he did, seeing as in 1969, Morton went 10-2-1 as the starting quarterback of the Cowboys and led the team to the playoffs while also leading the NFL in yards per pass attempt and yards per completion. Of course, the irony in all of this is that a couple of years later, the Cowboys decided to trade him to the place where he almost died and probably should have died, when they traded him to New York in the middle of the 1974 season after giving the keys to the franchise officially to Roger Staubach. However, in Morton's 3 seasons with the Giants, he only ever played one of them in New York City, with the 1974 season being in Connecticut and the 1976 season being in New Jersey. But I digress. The point is that after an argument over a payphone, a completely random person saved Craig Morton's career and saved his life. If that bystander was someone who wasn't good at fighting, if that bystander wasn't there, or if that bystander was someone who ran away from the scene because he didn't want to get involved and feared for his safety, Craig Morton would have likely died right then and there in 1969. If that bystander was someone who saw what was unfolding and just decided to go to the cops, it was probably too late. Morton's probably dead at that point. Instead, all thanks to a bystander and good Samaritan who probably had no idea what was going on, but just saw a guy getting beat into a pulp and wanted to step in and help him out, not knowing who the guy was, Morton only dealt with a broken thumb, and he played another decade and a half in the NFL and started 2 Super Bowls. You want to talk about how one moment in a person's life can change everything forever? This was that moment. From all accounts that I could find, Craig Morton went to the grave never knowing who that person was that saved his life. The American public has no idea who the person was, and neither do I. But Morton made the most of his second chance at life, to say the least, and will forever be remembered today as one of just a handful of quarterbacks to start for multiple teams in the biggest sporting event in the United States. He'll also be remembered as one of the toughest quarterbacks to ever play this sport. And to think it almost never happened because of a payphone and a courageous bystander in the right place at the right time. Whoever you are, thank you for saving Craig Morton's life, for extending it by another 60-ish years, and for allowing Morton, indirectly, to become an absolute legend. Rest in peace. Check out our live streaming schedule for the next few days. We're live every single day on this channel, whether we're covering a sporting event or playing GeoGuessr or just taking your requests. So make sure you like and subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single time that we go live and so that you can join this community. Also, thanks to all our members and our Patreon supporters who get exclusive perks like their name at the end of each video, members-only Q&A streams, and cool emojis to use on videos and during streams. See how you can join this community and become a member or a Patreon member by clicking the link in the description below.